Welcome. Today we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system. We're going to name the parts of the heart, the associated blood vessels, and their function of circulating blood throughout the body. We're going to be able to trace the pathway of blood through the heart. Later we'll talk about pathologic conditions, but we will look at the combining forms, the prefixes, and the suffixes of the cardiovascular system. And again, later we will look at laboratory tests and applying our knowledge. So the cardiovascular system is made up of the heart, which is frequently referred to as the pump, and the blood vessels, which are the pipes that the blood goes through. The heart, combining forms, is cardio or coronal. And blood vessels, be careful you don't confuse the general term of vessels with the more specific terms of arteries, veins, capillaries. But blood vessels, which is the general term that refers to any of the pipes that the blood travels through, combining forms are angio, vaso, and vasculo. So more specifically then, as we go away from the heart, the blood travels through arteries or arterioles. Arteries is artero or arterio, and since the blood is pumping from the heart, away from the heart to the rest of the body, it's a very high pressured system. So you'll notice a very thick walled membrane here on the arteries so that they can sustain those higher pressures. As you get farther away from the heart, they start to get smaller and are called arterioles, ol being small arteries. Then we get down into capillaries. Capillaries are small and they are single cell walls because this is where we're going to have the exchange of oxygen and nutrients to the cells. So the oxygen and the nutrients that the blood has been carrying is going to fuse out to the cells or the tissues, and the waste products or the carbon dioxide that are at the tissues are going to come into the capillary to be carried back to the heart and the lungs to get rid of. So from the capillaries, we actually start out small then with venules. Veins and venules are the vessels that come back towards the heart. So we start small with venules, little veins, and then we go to our larger veins. Combining forms for veins is flebo, veno, and veni. Since it's not as high pressured of a system, you'll notice a thinner wall than compared to the arteries. But since most of the blood is traveling uphill from the rest of the body to the heart, you will notice that there are some valves here in the veins that keep the blood from flowing backwards. So how does the blood flow throughout the body? We actually have two circulatory systems, a pulmonary circulatory system and a systemic circulatory system. So the pulmonic circulatory system comes from the right side of the heart to the lungs, picking up oxygen and returning to the left side of the heart. The systemic circulation is the blood that is coming from the left side of the heart, freshly oxygenated, and goes around to the tissues of the entire body, drops off the oxygen to the tissues, picks up the carbon dioxide, and brings that deoxygenated blood back to the right side of the heart. So we're going to talk about these in more detail. You have vessels throughout the body. The largest artery in the body is the aorta, which comes up off the left side of the heart here, arches, and then it goes behind the heart through the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. So the largest artery is the aorta, or aorto is the combining form. Then you have many branches where you can actually feel the pulse of the blood pumping through your body. You might be familiar with your carotid pulse, your brachial pulse, brachial pertaining to arm, or brachio is the combining form, radial pulse at your wrist, a femoral pulse. Behind your knee you have a popliteal pulse, and then you can feel dorsalis pedis or posterior tibialis in your feet if you have good circulation there as well. So looking at the heart, cardio and coronal are the combining forms for the heart. Blood comes from the top part of your body to the superior vena cava, and from the bottom part of your body through the inferior vena cava, and brings the deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium, or atrio is the combining form. That's the upper chamber of the heart, is your atria, and this is on the patient's right side. Then there is a door that the blood needs to travel through, and this is the tricuspid valve. It has 3 leaflets or flaps to that door. The tricuspid valve divides the right atria from the right ventricle, which is the lower chamber. The ventricles are actually kind of shaped like V's, if that helps you remember. The right ventricle, or ventriculo, and then blood will come up the pulmonary artery, where it hits another door, is the pulmonic valve. It has 3 flaps in there again, and blood will go out the pulmonary artery to the lungs. The pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein are a little bit different than other arteries and veins in the body. Normally, arteries going away from the heart are freshly oxygenated, but the pulmonary artery is the exception because it is going to the lungs, so it doesn't have a lot of oxygen. It's actually bringing that deoxygenated heavy CO2 content blood to the lungs, where it can get rid of the CO2 and pick up fresh oxygen. In the lungs is where it picks up that oxygen and drops off that carbon dioxide, and then it comes back through the pulmonary veins. And again, normally veins are deoxygenated, coming back to the heart, but since this is coming from the lungs, it is freshly oxygenated blood in the pulmonary veins. Brings the blood back to the left atrium, or atrio. Through the door is the mitral valve, which only has 2 flaps. So sometimes it's called the bicuspid, or bi, 2 flapped, 2 cusps valve, bicuspid valve. Through the bicuspid or mitral valve to the left ventricle, ventriculo, to another door, which is the aortic valve. You can see at the bottom is another tricuspid valve. Then blood will come up the aortic arch. There are branches that go off to your arms and to your head, and then down the arch behind the heart to the rest of the body. Sometimes people mix up the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve, and a mnemonic to help remember that is, or a saying is, sometimes you want to try, T-R-Y, something before you want to buy, B-U-Y, the product. So on the right you have tri, T-R-I, and on the left you have bi, B-I, cuspid valve. So that's just a way to help remember those. So our heart is made up of 4 chambers, or 4 rooms, divided by those doors, and there are walls in between these rooms as well. So in between the atria, we have our interatrial septum. A septum is a structure of a wall, and interatrial pertaining to in between the atria. The part that is in between the ventricles is the interventricular septum. Your heart is also made up of layers of those walls. This inner layer, depicted by the yellow here, is the endocardium, which is the structure, endo, within, cardio, heart, so the lining of the heart. The thick pink wall here is the myocardium, which is the structure of the muscle of the heart. And you'll notice on the left ventricle it's a little bit thicker than on the right ventricle because it's pumping out to the entire body versus just the lungs. And then the pericardium is the structure surrounding the heart, and it's actually made up of 2 layers. The visceral pericardium is the internal, remember visceral, like our visceral organs, our internal organs, and parietal, meaning pertaining to the outer wall. Parietal pericardium is the outer layer of the pericardium. The apex is a pointed point on an organ, and so the apex of the heart is at the base or the bottom of the heart. This picture just depicts the blood flow in a more diagrammatic fashion versus anatomical. So the left-hand column is your body, the middle column is your heart, and the right-hand column is your lung. Blood comes from the body to the superior and the inferior vena cava, where it goes to the heart, and it enters the right atrium. It goes through the door of the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, goes through the pulmonary valve where it hits the pulmonary artery, and all of these are depicted in blue as it is deoxygenated blood. In the capillaries of the lungs, we will drop off CO2 and pick up fresh oxygen. So it is now starting to be depicted pink for freshly oxygenated blood. As the blood then goes to the pulmonary veins, it enters into the left atrium of the heart, through the door of the mitral valve, down to the left ventricle, through the door of the aortic valve, to the aorta, to the rest of the body, where we will begin again. So that's blood flow through the heart, but it gets through the heart, through the body by the heart pumping this blood. And so the ventricles need to contract or squeeze or pump that blood. And then they need to relax and fill for the next beat. So when the ventricles are actively squeezing, it's called systole. And when the ventricles relax, it's called diastole. And your heart does this about 70 to 80 times a minute, which is your heart rate. And just FYI, about 100,000 times per day. Each pump is about 3 ounces of blood, which is about 5 quarts per minute, 75 gallons per hour, about 200 gallons a day on average, and all this without you really thinking about it. So what does systole and diastole look like? When the ventricles are at rest, the tricuspid and the mitral valves are open and blood is coming from the atria down into the ventricle. The pulmonic and the aortic valves are closed as the ventricles are just filling and relaxing in diastole. As the ventricles fill and the atria empty, then we will have the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve close, and the ventricles will start to contract or squeeze. This is the beginning of systole. As the pressure rises in these ventricles, it will force open the pulmonic valve and the aortic valve so that blood will go to the lungs through the pulmonary artery and to the body through the aorta. Once that occurs, the ventricles again will relax, the tricuspid and mitral valves will open, and we'll go through diastole again. So as we're going through systole and diastole and these valves are opening and closing, they make noise. And some people think it sounds like lub-dub, 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 is those valves or those doors opening and closing. Valves, valvulo, or valvo is the combining form. So the lub noise is the closure of the tricuspid and the mitral valve, signifying the beginning of systole, and the dub is the closure of the aortic and the pulmonic valves, or the end of systole. Don't stress over that for this class. But when the doors don't close properly, we can have some leaking or some swishing of the blood flow around those doors, regurgitation of them, and that can cause murmurs or that little swishing noise when the valves don't close correctly. And if we take our stethoscope, we can listen or auscultate the heart sounds. Now, stethoscope is actually a misnomer because we know scope means an instrument to visually examine. And as you know, we don't visually examine with a stethoscope. We listen or auscultate. Stetho does mean chest, so technically a stethoscope means an instrument to visually examine the chest. But that's not what we're doing. We're auscultating or listening, and we listen to many things besides just the chest. So in order to get the heart to contract, we must send out an electrical message to the muscles of the heart, telling it to contract. So the electrical system is pictured here by this yellow on the heart. And it starts with the sinoatrial node, which is in the atria here. And it's the sinus node that is the pacemaker cell of the heart. It sends out a message 60 to 80 times a minute: contract, contract, contract. But that message must be delivered to all the cells of the heart. So there are different pathways that will send that message through the right atrium and over to the left atrium. Then the message comes down to the atrioventricular node, which is a bundle of tissue here in between the atria and the ventricle, pertaining to the atria and the ventricle. It will actually pause the message for a moment, double check that it's at the rate we want it, and then send it on to the ventricles. From there, it goes through the bundle of His. It goes through the right bundle branch to the right ventricle and to the left bundle branch for the left ventricle. And then these little accessory fibers on here are called Purkinje fibers, which help get the message to every cell of the ventricle. Don't stress over this too much, but you should be familiar with the terms sinoatrial and atrioventricular, as they're good medical terms. The sinoatrial node is the pacemaker cell of the heart that sends out those messages, but if it becomes sick and isn't doing its job, other cells of the heart can pick up that message and stimulate the heart to contract. It just may not be as fast as we are normally used to. So if our heart is sending the messages normally from the sinoatrial node and down through that pathway as we expect, we will see this pattern on our EKG. The P wave symbolizes the message going through the atria, the QRS is the message going through the ventricle, and then the T wave is the ventricle getting ready to receive another message. So if that happens and we get that rhythm on our EKG, it came from the sinoatrial node and went through all normally. We call it normal sinus rhythm, which is abbreviated NSR or just SR. We can have disturbances in this rhythm, which could cause arrhythmias or dysrhythmias. So the abbreviation for a normal heart rhythm is, think about that for a moment, AV, BP, NSR, or SA. Correct, it's NSR for normal sinus rhythm or SR for sinus rhythm. AV would be the abbreviation for atrioventricular, BP for blood pressure, and SA for sinoatrial. So when we are pumping blood out to the body, we can measure this pressure, and since our heart has the systole and diastole phases, we will measure this pressure in a fraction. When the heart is actually pumping out blood in systole to the rest of the body, it will be a higher number of this blood pressure, and when the ventricles are at rest during diastole, that will be our lower number. So our blood pressure, like 120 over 80 is norm, is listed as a fraction, systole over diastole. And we measure our blood pressure with a sphygmomanometer. Meter is an instrument to measure. Sphygmo actually means pulse. We're actually measuring the pulse pressure or the pressure in our vessels when that heart is pumping and at rest. So I hope this provided a nice overview of the cardiovascular anatomy and systems for you. Continue to study your terms, your combining forms, prefixes, and suffixes. Thank you.